My name is Paul Kaplan, and in this talk we'll discuss Yonatan, the Apostle John's implacable rage at the crooked rabbis whose greed for money and power had destroyed the covenant of the Ten Commandments. And we'll begin by saying that the book of Revelation is a Jewish document, even if it is part of the New Testament, because Yonatan wrote this document while he was a prisoner on the island of Patmos. And he'd been sent there because the Romans and rabbis considered him to be a potentially dangerous successor to Jesus. Because although the murder of Jesus had virtually destroyed any hope of saving the covenant in those days, Yonatan was nevertheless convinced that some future generation would have the mental capacity to decode his deeply veiled and jumbled narrative of how the covenant had been broken. And when this distant, advanced generation made its appearance, it would marvel at the enormous courage and nobility of Jesus and what he had done. And this distant generation would be determined to finish what Jesus had started. And as it turns out, we ourselves are that far-off generation imagined by Yonatan. And we can indeed understand his rage and bitterness at the greed and cynicism of the rabbis and the Romans who brought Israel down for money and power. So in those days, this document could have been extremely dangerous to both the Romans and the rabbis, since it could have started off a major rebellion. So John knew that if any Romans or rabbis were ever to understand his writings, they would immediately have murdered him and all his colleagues, and would have tracked down and destroyed every trace of his book. But Yonatan, like his colleague Jesus, was a very brave and dedicated man. And he kept working on the book despite the constant danger. He was convinced, as we said, that some generation in the distant future would have the mental capacity to understand his mysterious and jumbled writings, and would be inspired to finish what Jesus had started. Yonatan was content to allow the document to become part of the New Testament, because this would prevent the rabbis from destroying it. So here we are, 2,000 years later, and we are the first generation with the intellectual resources to understand Yonatan's deeply jumbled and veiled document. And it's therefore up to us, Jew or Christian, to tell the world what Jesus had in mind and to finish what he started. Let's see if we can do that. This will be an enormous biblical event because it'll amount to nothing less than the long-awaited second coming. And it'll quickly result in a furious confrontation between a number of Jews and their synagogue, the fury of which has never been seen before. Here follows an extract from our book, God versus the Left. And all hell is now about to break loose. During the Roman occupation of Israel, a corrupt clique of rabbis swamped the clear and powerful Ten Commandments of the Covenant with the gigantic set of books known as the Talmud of Babylon. And they did this in collusion with cynical Roman officials in order to create a gigantic Talmud education industry, knowing full well that the huge Talmud would completely swamp the simple oral law which made the Ten Commandments clear and understandable to everyone. Moses and the elders had specially designed the oral law for the Levites to use in order to hammer the spirit and intent of the covenant into the nation. And the system had worked perfectly for almost 1,300 years. The rabbis knew very well that when they replaced the oral law with the Talmud would destroy the oral law and lead to the dreaded breach of the covenant, the ultimate catastrophe that would bring the nation crashing down. So in chapter 17 of Revelation, Yonatan reveals his mortal hatred of the rabbis, whose greed and lust for power had betrayed Israel and who had caused the murder of his lifelong colleague Jesus, who had fought to his last breath to prevent the rabbis from destroying the covenant. So it's little wonder that John regarded the rabbis as the whore who had sold the covenant for money and power. And he referred to them and their Babylonian Talmud as the whore of Babylon. So here's the extract from God versus the Left, which discusses John's blazing hatred of the rabbis. In chapter 7 of Revelation, John let fly at the priests who had sold the covenant for money, the same crooked priesthood that still controls Jewish thinking to this day. And he described them collectively as a whore, clad in the purple of Roman royalty and the scarlet of a prostitute, descended from 7 generations of corrupt kings and 10 generations of corrupt priesthoods, living in luxury, crime, corruption, and fornication. He said that they and their Talmudic empire were clearly the mother of all harlots and the abominations of the earth. He said that they were drunk with the blood of Jesus and the other decent people they had murdered for defending the covenant, and when he saw this whore, he was astounded. He said that the entire rotten organization would eventually be forced out of its bottomless pit of corruption and would be damned to perdition. The full name of the Talmud is the Babylonian Talmud, because most of it was created in Babylon, and John therefore referred to the combination of the priests and their Talmud simply as Babylon. And that's the end of the extract from God versus the Left. However, there is one more thing that John had to say about the eventual downfall of the rabbis, because he had seen at first hand how arrogant and dictatorial they were towards their own followers. And they are just as arrogant and dictatorial to this day, particularly in Israel, where the rabbis hold a strategic minority in the Knesset and have the government over a barrel all the time. And they treat their own people like dirt. John observed in Revelation 17, verse 16, that as soon as these downtrodden black-garbed fools saw the rabbis begin to crumble under the wave of public anger, they would grab the opportunity to turn on them in fury. As John put it in Revelation 17:16 onwards, and the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. In other words, they will have to take the rabbinical bullying until such time as God lets them put a stop to it, and not a moment longer. So we have now reached the end of the age of the Roman religion. In other words, the days of the Gentiles are fulfilled, and Christianity is at an end. However, although the gigantic ancient Roman organization known as Christianity may have virtually ceased to exist, there are still hundreds of millions of decent people who remain as godly as ever, and who certainly do not wish to abandon their faith in God. The question is, what is the next move for these hundreds of millions of decent Christian people, now that the Roman Church has become virtually useless? Well, the Bible states that a small number of highly motivated Jews, 144,000 in number, are about to launch a furious revolution against their rabbis and their Talmud. And they will be supported by millions of Christians. And after these twin monstrosities, the rabbis and their Talmud, have been utterly obliterated, the Jews and Christians will unite to create a new covenant that will set up 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. The photograph in the video shows clearly the type of people who've been controlling Jewish thought for 2,000 years. And it's easy to see why John detested them as he did. And they've not changed at all in 2,000 years. those rabbis are every bit as rotten now as they were then. And now we can clearly understand John's anger in Revelation 17. So you can see for yourself in this photo from the New York Times in July 2009, how a group of these low-life scoundrels were arrested by New York detectives. And when these money-laundering priests of Babylon were dragged off in irons, there was hardly any reaction from the synagogues, apart from their usual protestations of innocence. It is intolerable that the soul of Israel should be in the hands of such people as these. So that's where we are right now. The Jews are paralyzed and the Christians have no church. But God remains. And Jesus, John, and the other giants knew how it would be. There is harsh work ahead, but we will be serving God. So if you generally agree with this video, then you will certainly agree with this, that this viewpoint must be made known as widely as possible. As we've said before, the enormous power of the internet can and should be harnessed by godly people. And if we do, the left will be powerless to resist. Unfortunately, internet publicity costs money, and if ever there was a case for crowdfunding, it is here and now. And your financial contributions to our Patreon site, however small, can join a mighty river that can move people to action all over the world. You may also want to read our book, God versus the Left, which tells us where we are and where we need to go. The book is available from Amazon. And finally, as we've said before, your comments and suggestions are just as essential as your financial contributions and will be most welcome here and on our Patreon and Facebook sites. It's almost impossible to handle something of this magnitude without the help of millions of decent people. And please don't forget to click the subscribe button, because there'll be no shortage of people trying to get these videos banned, and we may have to resort to email to get these videos to you. So this is Paul Kaplan signing out and advising you that we'll be releasing new videos at approximately 1 per week. So until then, thank you for your time and attention.